Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and if you call James, I should be pleased. You call Shame, I should assume it was James, and you just couldn't quite articulate the words properly after dinner. I have to tell you, I've cheated a little bit. I came in rather assuming these fine wooden boxes contain cigars, and I thought it'd be fun to have one. There's nothing in this box whatsoever. This box, in contrast, I have to tell you, something really interesting in it. And I know I'm using up my time, but who'd have guessed that you'd have a large rubber cock sitting in the Oxford box? Anyway, enough said on that. But it's quite an important point, because that little rubber cock is all about trying to look good, I suspect, rather than doing good. And you might think, well, haven't we all therefore already lost the plot, lost the case, and aren't you going to say shame and resign? But I want to move away from the short-term easy jokes and talk about actually the profound importance of the motion that the House believes there is nothing wrong with spending more on looking good than doing good. Now, the motion itself, I find surprisingly ambiguous, and I suspect it is intentionally so, because it is requiring us to think very carefully about the notions of what is wrong, what is spending, what is looking good and doing good. So if I begin with the premise that we need to talk about what is good and what is not good, we move immediately into the field of ethics and aesthetics. We are dealing immediately with the challenge that there is something inherently right or wrong about being able to make choice. So for me, this is not an issue of either or, but this is a question of and. Can we not do things that both look good and which do good? Need they be in conflict, and need we be judgmental about whether one is inherently better than the other? So I would move the premise that we should not be axiomatic about the premise that it is inherently wrong to spend more on looking good than it is doing good. I would say that we need to be conditional in our assessment of what is good and what is not good, and also conditional in terms of who is looking and who is doing and what are the outcomes of both. I think there is then the practical and fundamental reality that if we direct how society should behave, then actually we have given up on the challenges of democracy, freedom and the rule of law, which binds us in British society and allows each and every individual to determine the extent to which they devote their resources, their energies and their time to either looking good or doing good. I would further suggest that if we were to define behaviour such that we denied people the capacity to spend on looking good, then we may actually reduce net societal benefit, because it is not the case that if we deny people the opportunity to behave in one way that is not, as we perceive it, optimal, that necessarily they will behave in the way that we would prefer. So it could be that there is a net loss from saying that people have to do good rather than look good. I also go on and question this issue about what exactly is being spent. Now, spending is a process by which something is used. But need it necessarily be about cash? Need it necessarily be monetized? Now, shame, because you're playing on your phone when I ought to be listened to. That's very fine, spending his time not listening to me. I'm sure at Oxford they teach people to listen, but there we go. I will carry on. And I would say that therefore when we think about what is being spent, we need to distinguish between money and time and indeed people's lives. And if we are going to raise the stakes and talk about how people spend their lives, how people give their lives, then we need to be very clear about what we mean by looking good and doing good. So to me, when we think about looking good, I'm not talking about whether one looks fabulous, whether you all look gorgeous and glorious. I'm talking at about a much more deep level of looking good in the eyes of the Lord, looking good in the context of being seen to be doing the right thing. And I do think that if we are going to require society to join in a momentum, in a shared vision, in something that can gather pace and create better outcomes, then being seen to be counted, standing together, is a critical part of what motivates society to move together. I then think that we need to think quite carefully about what we mean by good, and I was spending some time trying to understand what the great philosophers have said about good, and I came across the works of Immanuel Kant, and I have to say they're quite boring for those of you who've not read them, but if you have read them, you will be aware that what Kant says is that good is essentially a cultural idiom. It is a choice. It is a set of values that are unique and specific. And if it is the case, therefore, that the definition of good is something that we must define for ourselves, and here we are in Oxford, we need to think carefully about what we think good might mean within the context of debating here in the Oxford Union, and whether or not looking good and doing good in that frame is something that is necessarily better or less worthwhile. I find it very revealing that the Oxford Union was built and prospered just as the Oxford movement in the Anglo-Catholic tradition was also beginning to become more substantial and to wield more influence. And this was a period where there was a great sense that we needed to be broader in our assessment of how we might move society. And I would argue that actually this was a period when that very strong Victorian sense of cultural imperialism, through the act of doing, created a lot of the misery that was the result of the invasive empire behaviours of the 19th century. So I want to look back beyond the Anglo-Catholic traditions of the 19th century, both to the purer sense of Christian tradition and being seen to do good in the eyes of the Lord, but also the premise that you have to love yourself before you can love others, and the premise that therefore you need to remove the beam from your own eye before looking at the mote in others is of critical significance. But earlier than that, there was Cicero, and Cicero made some very interesting comments about ethics and aesthetics, and he argued that ethics were about obligation, that doing things was simply getting things done. There was no real merit in doing. However, the aesthetics of choice, the aesthetics of how you do things, he argued were more important for society. And against that background, I do think that it is critically important to recognise that if we accept that there is nothing inherently wrong with spending more on looking good than doing good, then you should absolutely support the motion that against that backcloth, society is better off by trying to find a means by which looking good and doing good together can bear greater fruit. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time.